also like to congratulate Marcin Stanowski with fantastic work in creating this amazing new institution, Kaspar. So I think this will be a possibility to basically fill facts to an area where facts are missing, and to continue collaboration in this research field, which I think will be very exciting in the years to come. So I will continue with Alan Salk talking about some of the implications of the religious change that are taking place and why we should pay attention to global religious beliefs and variation over time. So religion is an important identity marker. It can be important for example, lifestyles, which are important for health. It can imply how you have implications for what you eat, how you exercise, how many children you have, the type of family constellations you end up with. But it can also relate on a macro scale to a sense of community, whether you are willing to participate in transfer systems, social security systems, which are aimed at addressing common goals, such as climate change, and in risk-sharing systems. So I think religion is an area which becomes increasingly important over time, and where facts and data have been missing for too long. The current presentation will focus on three major issues, one being income inequality and religion, the second being health and religion, and the third being environmental challenges, in particular climate change and religion. So there's a growing consensus that tackling climate change is, one cannot solely focus on the type of technical solutions which are often addressed nowadays, but also to stress the importance of human behavior, of attitudes, and ultimately consumption patterns and demographic patterns, and how this will affect climate solutions in the futures. And the type of responses that one could see as appropriate could be hampered or supported by religion and culture. And a more holistic approach would require that we have excellent data on religious issues, for example, religious affiliation. Also because this can be a fundamental marker of community belonging, and as I will come back to, it could be important to address social justice issues between different religious groups. And the perceived importance, for instance, of human activity in driving climate change can depend on one's religious reasoning, where, for example, a high level of religiosity can increase the importance of people looking at climate change as an area where human behavior can be important, or where it's more up to fate, where it's more up to forces outside one's own control. And it could also be important for which type of policies that are more effective in terms of both mitigating climate change, but also for how to effectively adapt to climate change. Past research has shown that in the aftermath of natural disasters, many individuals turn to religion to cope with this type of tragedies. And this effect might be stronger in less developed societies, particularly where religious institutions provide social and health services, and also where environmental risks often are greater. So religion might increase in the wake of climatic change and climatic challenges. And aligning environmental policies with culture, with religion, may increase the likelihood of successfully coping with climate change and other environmental challenges. But in spite of this, secular countries often advocate technologies and policies without taking into account the religious context. In spite of the fact that what will soon be the most populous countries on the planet, such as India, almost everyone in the population has a religion, according to the census, and their sustainability policies are often aimed with spiritual aims, and this may be a way of making them more effective. Some evidence suggests that, for example, in the US among Christians, religiosity relates positively to pro-environmental behaviors, although it does not affect pro-environmental attitudes or beliefs. Other research suggests that individuals who, by religious conviction, ascribe environmental change to chance or fate tend to engage less in pro-environmental behaviors. So there's some mixed evidence. And the type of ability to cope with challenges, which requires communal collective action, could be less if there is more cultural religious divisions in society, where divisions go along lines which might oppose the way one looks at, for example, climate change and whether it is driven by human behavior or not. So some of this data, which of course was a joint was a long-term collaboration with Pew and my own group, where Martin did much of the modeling, shows that there will be an increase in religion over time, and that there's a large variation across the world in the type of religious affiliation that individuals have, depending on country. So basically, as you see by the world map, there's where the red color and the darker shade of red color suggests indicates a higher proportion of Christians. Green represents Muslims, and gray unaffiliated, yellow Buddhists. And you can see that the further away you go from the origins of Christianity, the more Christian the world is. With the Northern Europe, the global North, the Americas, the southern part of sub-Saharan Africa and much of Oceania being Christian, while areas closer to Northern Africa, West Asia, but also parts of India and China tend to be more located in parts of the world that might be more affected by climate change. So as Alan mentioned earlier, there will be a change in religion over time, where you have an increase in the proportion who are religious, increasing from 84 to 87%. There will also be a demographic aging taking place. All religions will age, but they will age in a differential manner. And I will come back to age in a little bit, why age is important. And also there's changes in the proportion of unaffiliated taking place over time, where it's important to notice that the majority of the unaffiliated populations in the world are located in the Asia Pacific, in countries such as China, but also, for instance, Japan being important. So the first measure of social inequality we will look at is income and religion. And this graph shows estimates by Jose Navarro and myself on income distributions by religion globally. And even if Christians represented roughly almost a third of the world population, and its share will be relatively stable, we project, based on both our religious projections and independent income projections, that the proportion of the world's income will disproportionately go to the Christian populations. So the Christians will have a total income of more than $90 trillion in the year 2050. It will continue to be the religion with a high share of income. And even if the Muslim population will increase, its share of total income will likely not increase as much as its demographic weight, which implies that they're likely not to overtake, for example, the unaffiliated population in terms of relative income in the world. There's also some interesting changes taking place. In 2010, the Hindus are having less income than the Buddhists, but in the coming decades, we are likely to see a shift where the Hindus, because of the predicted economic growth of India in particular, likely to having a greater share of income in the coming decades than the Buddhists. This shows GDP, gross domestic production, per capita and by religious minorities. And you see that there's huge variation across the world, but and also variation which overlaps with religious groups. This is an estimate of absolute poverty by religious group, and we find that in 2010, the proportion of any religious group with the highest share of absolute poverty, highest population share living in absolute poverty would be among the Hindus, followed by other religions and Muslims. So there is large variation in poverty by different religious groups. And this is something that can be important because religion and income inequality might have implications for example, social policy, voting behaviors, and communal behavior. So that was a very short example of income variation by religion, some short evidence on that. And now we will discuss a bit on health and religion before we turn to environmental impacts. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Global Burden of Disease project, but this is something we have been working on for quite a few years. It's led by the IHME group in Seattle, and it has some wonderful indices of health, which incorporates basically all diseases and life expectancy. And it's the DAL indicator is disability adjusted life years is a measure which takes into account both years of life lost and years lived with disease. So it's a measure which of poor health. So the higher the DAL is, the worse your health, and it incorporates both disease prevalence, disease severity, and how many years you live with disease, and also the number of years you lose by early mortality. And globally, we find that there is variation in the number of DALIs which by religious group. So we find that among, for example, the Hindus, which has the highest disease burden, the DALIs is much larger than the number of DALIs per 1,000 people is much larger than the case would be among the unaffiliated. And the Muslims also have a relatively high share of DALIs. This is largely driven by the fact that large share of Hindu and Muslim populations live in countries with fairly poor health and low life expectancy and high disease prevalence, followed by Christians, while the Buddhists are in much better health. But there's also large variations across world region. We, for example, find that within Africa, you find the highest disease burden, actually the highest disease burden among any religious group for any world region among the Christian population. And some of the lowest disease burdens are found for world regions in North America, where the differences across religious groups are fairly low. And if you look at specific types of diseases, if you look at infectious disease, you find very large differences across countries and world religions. So you find that the lowest disease burden for communicable disease are found among the unaffiliated, while the highest are found for Hindus and Muslims. Again, there's huge variation across world continents, and you find fairly low levels in Europe and North America, Oceania in particular, and very high levels still in Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, and more among certain religious groups than others. But if you look at, so globally, due to the epidemiological transition, there's been a shift from communicable to non-communicable disease. People are less likely to suffer from infectious diseases than earlier, partly because of vaccinations, partly because of better treatment, but increasingly likely to live longer with non-communicable diseases, where cancers, cardiovascular disease, but also depression, diabetes, mental health, musculoskeletal problems are dominant. And here you find, for non-communicable diseases, you find much lower variation across world regions than what you found for the case of NCDs. We found much larger differences by religious groups. So, and you also found that the world regions affected are very different. So the world region which has the highest DALIs for non-communicable disease is partly due to population aging and the fact that this world region is at an advanced stage in the epidemiological transition is in Europe. And this is an area where Africa does best. They have lower levels of non-communicable diseases than other world regions at the present. However, with global population aging also taking place in Africa in particular, this will probably change in the years to come. Now, for the final part of my talk, which will be the most extensive one, we will focus on the environmental issues. And we already discussed a little bit why we should pay attention to global religious beliefs when discussing environmental challenges. Well, first of all, global environmental challenges tend to coincide with rapid changes in religious belief. And changes in religious belief, again, can have implications for how environmental risks are perceived and which responses that may be efficient in terms of addressing these risks. And it could also have implications for how one attributes the causes of environmental changes, but also how, for example, willingness to pay, willingness to increase taxation for climate change-related mitigation and adaptation initiatives can differ by religious affiliation. So some of the data was already presented by Alan, so I won't go in detail on this. But for this product, we also take into account not only religious change, but also environmental change. And this world map shows greenhouse gases, where a darker color shows a higher level of emissions of greenhouse gases. And again, whether it's red, green, gray, or yellow represents the type of religion that is dominant in the country. So you see that greenhouse gas emissions tend to disproportionately come from the Americas, particularly North America, and China being the major emitters. Europe is still a major emitter, but there has been declines in emissions over time. And but many other parts of the world, there's very low levels of emission, including some parts of North Africa, some Muslim parts of North Africa. However, other parts, such as Saudi Arabia, are extremely important in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. This is, by the way, a project done in collaboration with colleagues at CSIN, which is an environmental research institute focusing on climate change at Columbia University. Now, this is a very different measure. This is the so-called Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative. And it shows which countries, and in this case, which religions, that are best prepared for climate change. It basically shows how much resources and capacities they have to prepare to deal with global changes brought about by overcrowding, resource constraints, and climate disruption. And a higher level, meaning a more darker color in this case, is better. So this suggests that many of the countries that are among the major contributors to climate change are also the countries that are best prepared to deal with the consequences, to adapt to climate change. And many of the countries that are least able to deal with climate change tend to be relatively poor countries, but they also tend to be countries located in areas dominated by certain religions, including certain parts of Asia, Northern Africa, parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, and also some regions in the Americas. This is another measure of environmental stress, not focused purely on climate change, and that is water stress, and water stress by major religions around the world. And what we find is that there is a huge variation in which parts of the planet that are most subject to water stress. You find that much of Muslim West Asia, North Africa, but also some countries in the Americas, such as Mexico, and in sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa, Australia, and India, are likely to be subject to severe or extremely high levels of water stress in the years to come. And finally, this measure looks at median age and major religions. And you find that countries that have a higher median age tend to often be located in the north and the west, and also be located in some of the countries that are best prepared for and dominated by certain religions. I'll come back to that in a second. So this graph shows regression estimates, and what we find is that the more religious a country is, the less it contributes to climate change. The greater the share of religion in a country, the lower its contribution to climate change in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. But at the same time, the countries that have the high share of religion are also the countries that are least prepared and most at risk. So countries that cause climate change, who are more religious, tend also to be more subject to the adverse consequences of climate change, and they are less prepared to deal with it. I mentioned age earlier. These data shows among Christian and Muslim countries median ages and how well they are prepared to deal with climate change, and energy use on the left, and the adaptation index, the ND gain measure on the right. And you generally see that older countries tend to use more energy, but also to have and thereby contribute more to climate change. But on the other hand, as you see on the right-hand side graph, they are also, both among Christian and Muslim majority countries, you find that they are better prepared to deal with the consequences of climate change. All the populations are currently better able to deal with climate change across and within religious groups. So this shows an estimate of overall environmental change preparedness. We find that the Jews, the unaffiliated, and the Buddhists are the three groups that are best prepared for climate change, while Hindus and Muslims are the groups that are least prepared for climate change. And to conclude, countries that have greater GDP tend to be less religious, have greater emissions, but they also face rapid aging and low population growth. In contrast, developing countries tend to be more religious, have lower adaptive capacity, and younger after often growing populations. And our findings suggest that more secular countries, in terms of having a larger religiously unaffiliated share, contributes more to climate change, yet more religious countries will experience more climate-related effects and adverse consequences of climate change. Thank you.